Hello, friends. We're thrilled to step away from our usual routine of dissecting the fascinating lives of birds, one species at a time, to dive into something a bit different. The Feather Thief by Kirk Wallace Johnson. This is a story of a museum heist, someone who stole rare bird skins from a museum in order to sell them on the dark web to fly fishermen. It turns out that there's a whole underground network of illegal fly tyers selling these feathers. It's both wild and horrific. We're going to dive deep into this topic and the heist as well in this mini-series. Two of our esteemed hosts, Bates and Shannon Hackett, are curators of birds at the Field Museum in Chicago, making them perfect guides to unravel this strange and captivating story. We'd love for you to join us by picking up a copy of the book and reading along. We'll be offering a treasure trove of behind-the-scenes insights into the world of museum work and its bird collections, so trust me, you won't want to miss a word. For those of you who haven't had the chance to read it yet, we thought we'd share the prologue, which sets the stage for the book's dark and twisted tale. I have to say, Kirk Wallace Johnson's writing is so gripping that I hope reading it out loud does even a fraction of it justice. Also, I may have had a bit too much fun with the sound design, but honestly, that's why we're doing this in the first place, because it's fun. The reading this week is all me, and also the prologue is the only part of the book that we'll be reading aloud in this mini-series. Our regular lineup, John, Shannon, Amanda, and myself, will be back for the rest of the episodes, and we'll be joined by ornithologist and fly tyer Jason Weckstein for a few chats along the way. Then we'll cap it all off with an interview with the author himself, Kirk Wallace Johnson. Alright, so sit back, relax, grab your binoculars, and enjoy the prologue.
By the time Edwin Riss stepped off the train onto the platform at Tring, 40 miles north of London, it was already quite late. The residents of the sleepy town had finished their suppers, the little ones were in bed. As he began the long walk into town, the Midland line glided off into the darkness. A few hours earlier, Edwin had performed in the Royal Academy of Music's London Soundscapes. Before the concert, he'd packed a pair of latex gloves, a miniature LED flashlight, a wire cutter, and a diamond blade glass cutter in a large rolling suitcase and stowed it in his concert hall locker. He bore a passing resemblance to a lanky Pete Townsend, intense eyes, prominent nose, and a mop of hair, although instead of shredding a Fender, Edwin played the flute. There was a new moon that evening, making the already glooming stretch of the road even darker. For nearly an hour, he dragged his suitcase through the mud and gravel skirting the road, under gnarly old trees strangled with ivy. A car blasted by, its headlights blinding. Adrenaline coursing, he knew he was getting close. The entrance to the market town of Tring is guarded by a 16th century pub called the Robin Hood. A few roads beyond, nestled between the old Tring Brewery and an HSBC branch, lies the entrance to Public Footpath 37. Known to locals as Bank Alley, the footpath isn't more than 8 feet wide and is framed by 7-foot-high brick walls. Edwin slipped into the alley, into total darkness. He groped his way along until he was standing directly behind the building he'd spent months casing. All that separated him from it was a wall, capped with 3 rusted strands of barbed wire. It might have thwarted his plans were it not for the wire cutter. After clearing an opening, he lifted the suitcase to the ledge, hoisted himself up, and glanced anxiously about. No sign of the guard. There was a space of several feet between his perch on the wall and the building's nearest window, forming a small ravine. If he fell, he could injure himself, or worse, make a clamor that would summon security. But he'd known this part wouldn't be easy. Crouched on top of the wall, he reached toward the window with the glass cutter and began to grind it along the pane. Cutting glass was harder than he had anticipated, though, and as he struggled to carve an opening, the glass cutter slipped from his hand and fell into the ravine. His mind raced. Was this a sign? He was thinking about bailing on the whole crazy scheme when that voice, the one that had urged him onward these past months, shouted, "Wait a minute, you can't give up now. You've come all this way." He crawled back down and picked up a rock. Steadying himself atop the wall, he peered around in search of guards before bashing the window out, wedging his suitcase through the shard-strewn opening, and climbing into the British Natural History Museum. Unaware that he had just tripped the alarm in the security guard's office, Edwin pulled out an LED light, which cast a faint glow in front of him as he made his way down the hallways toward the vault, just as he'd rehearsed in his mind. He wheeled his suitcase quietly through the corridor after corridor, drawing ever close to the most beautiful things he had ever seen. If he pulled this off, they would bring him fame, wealth, and prestige. They would solve his problems. He deserved them. He entered the vault, its hundreds of large white steel cabinets standing in rows like sentries, and got to work. He pulled out the first drawer, catching a waft of mothballs. Quivering beneath his fingertips were a dozen red-roofed fruit crows, gathered by naturalists and biologists over hundreds of years from the forests and jungles of South America and fastidiously preserved by generations of curators for the benefit of future research. Their coppery orange feathers glimmered despite the faint light. Each bird, maybe 1.5 feet from beak to tail, lay on its back in funerary repose, eye sockets filled with cotton, feet folded close against the body. Tied around their legs were biodata labels, faded, handwritten records of the date, altitude, latitude, and longitude of their capture, along with other vital details. He unzipped the suitcase and began filling it with the birds, emptying one drawer after another. The Occidentalist subspecies that he snatched by the handful had been gathered a century earlier from the Quindio Andes region of western Colombia. He didn't know exactly how many he'd be able to fit in his suitcase, but he managed 47 of the museum's 48 male specimen before wheeling his bag onto the next cabinet. Down in the security office, the guard was fixated on a small television screen. Engrossed in a soccer match, he hadn't yet noticed the alarm indicator blinking on a nearby panel. Edwin opened the next cabinet to reveal dozens of resplendent quetzal skins gathered in the 1880s from the Chiriquí cloud forests of western Panama, a species now threatened by widespread deforestation and protected by international treaties. At nearly 4 feet in length, the birds were particularly difficult to stuff into his suitcase, but he maneuvered 39 of them inside by gently curling their sweeping tails into tight coils. Moving down the corridor, he swung open the doors of another cabinet, this one housing species of the Cotinga birds of South and Central America. He swiped 14 100-year-old skins of the lovely Cotinga, a small turquoise bird with a reddish-purple breast endemic to Central America, before relieving the museum of 37 specimens of the purple-breasted Cotinga, 21 skins of the spangled Cotinga, and another 10 skins of the endangered banded Cotinga, of which as few as 250 mature individuals are estimated to be alive today. The Galapagos Island finches and mockingbirds gathered by Charles Darwin in 1835 during the voyage of the HMS Beagle, which had been instrumental in developing his theory of evolution through natural selection, were resting in nearby drawers. Among the museum's most valuable holdings were skeletons and skins of extinct birds, including the dodo, the great auk, and the passenger pigeon, along with an elephant folio edition of John James Audubon's The Birds of America. Overall, the museum houses one of the world's largest collection of ornithological specimens, 750,000 bird skins, 15,000 skeletons, 17,000 birds preserved in spirit, 4,000 nests, and 400,000 sets of eggs gathered over the centuries from the world's most remote forests, mountainsides, jungles, and swamps. But Edwin hadn't broken into the museum for a drab-colored finch. He had lost track of how long he'd been in the vault when he finally wheeled his suitcase to a stop before a large cabinet. 37 kingbirds of paradise swiped in seconds, 24 magnificent rifle birds, 12 superb birds of paradise, 4 bluebirds of paradise, 17 flame bower birds. These flawless specimens, gathered against almost impossible odds from virgin forests in New Guinea 150 years earlier, went into Edwin's bag, their tags bearing the name of a self-taught naturalist whose breakthrough had given Darwin the scare of his life, A.R. Wallace. The guard glanced at the CCTV feed, an array of shots of the parking lot and museum campus. He began his round, pacing the hallways, checking the doors, scanning for anything awry. Edwin had long since lost count of the number of birds that passed through his hands. He had originally planned to choose only the best of each species, but in the excitement of the plunder, he grabbed and stuffed until his suitcase could hold no more. The guard stepped outside to begin a perimeter check, glancing up at the windows and beaming his flashlight on the section near the brick wall of Bank Alley. Edwin stood before the broken window, now framed with shards of glass. So far, everything had gone according to plan, with the exception of the missing glass cutter. All that remained was to climb back out the window without slicing himself open and melt into the anonymity of the street. I was waist-high in the Red River, which slices through the Sangre de Cristo Mountains just north of Taos, New Mexico, when I first heard the name Edwin Rist. My fly line was mid-cast, hovering energetically above the current behind me, ready to shoot forward in pursuit of the golden-bellied trout that Spencer Same, my fly fishing guide, had assured me was hiding behind a car-sized boulder in the middle of the stream. Spencer could sense fish behind logs, through the white froth of fast currents, in the blackness of deep pools, and in the chaos of swirling eddies. He was certain that a 14-incher was fanning a foot below the surface, waiting for the perfect fly if I could cast it right. He broke into the museum to steal what? Distracted by what I just heard, I blew the cast, slapping the line against the water, sending any trout below darting off. Dead birds? Until that moment, we'd spoken only in hushed tones so as to not scare off the fish, approaching each hole as deftly as possible, mindful of the sun and where it might throw our shadows, but I couldn't contain my disbelief. I just heard one of the strangest stories of my life, and Spencer was only at the beginning of it. Normally, nothing could break my concentration on the river. When I wasn't fishing, I'd count the weeks and the days until I could pull on a pair of waders and slosh into the water. I'd leave my cell phone in the trunk of the car to buzz until its battery died, keep a fistful of almonds in my pocket to ward off hunger, and drink from the stream when thirsty. On good days, I'd spend 8 straight hours working my way up the river without seeing another human being. It was the only thing that brought calm amid the storm of stress that had become my life. 7 years earlier, while on vacation from my job coordinating the reconstruction of the Iraqi city of Fallujah for USAID, I sleepwalked out of a window in a PTSD-triggered state and nearly died. I was left with broken wrists, a shattered jaw, broken nose, and a cracked skull, with scores of stitches across my face. During my recovery, I realized that many of my Iraqi colleagues, translators, civil engineers, teachers, and doctors, were being hunted and killed by their own countrymen because they had, quote, collaborated with the United States. I spoke out on their behalf in an op-ed in the Los Angeles Times, naively thinking that someone in power would swiftly fix things by granting them visas. I hadn't anticipated the thousands of emails that would soon flood in from Iraqis imploring me for help. I was unemployed, sleeping on a futon in my aunt's basement. I didn't know the first thing about helping refugees, but I started a list to track the names of everyone who wrote to me. Within months, I launched my nonprofit organization, the List Project. Over the coming several years, I wrestled with the White House, cajoled senators, rallied volunteers, and begged for donations to keep my staff paid. Though we managed to bring thousands of refugees to safety in the United States over the years, it was clear that we would never be able to help everyone. For every victory, there were 50 cases stalled in a federal bureaucracy that treated these interpreters, the moment they fled Iraq, as potential terrorists. By the fall of 2011, as the official end to the war was drawing near, I felt trapped in a cage of my own creation. There were still tens of thousands of Iraqis and Afghans running for their lives. It could take a decade, maybe even several, to get them out, but I never managed to raise enough funds for more than a year down the road. Once the war was over, in the minds of the American public, it would only be harder. Whenever I felt like giving up, I'd get another desperate appeal from a former Iraqi colleague and grow ashamed of my weakness. But the truth was, I was exhausted. Ever since the accident, I couldn't fall asleep without distracting myself, so I queued up an endless sequence of the most boring shows I could find on Netflix. Every morning, I woke to a new tide of refugee petitions. Unexpectedly, fly fishing became kind of a release. Out on the river, there were no journalists to call or donors to beseech, just currents and insects to study and rising trout to tempt. Time took on an unusual quality. 5 hours would pass in what felt like 30 minutes. After a day in my waders, I would close my eyes and see faint outlines of fish fanning dreamily upstream as I drifted into a deep sleep. It was such an act of escapism that had deposited me on that mountain stream in northern New Mexico. I'd hopped into my beat-up Sebring convertible and driven from Boston to Taos to work on a book about my experiences in Iraq at a small artist colony in town. Writer's block rolled in on the first day. I didn't have a book deal, I had never written a book before, and my narcoleptic literary agent was ignoring my increasingly anxious requests for guidance. Meanwhile, the list of refugees kept growing. I had just turned 31 and didn't know why the hell I was in Taos, much less what I was supposed to do next. When my stress peaked, I searched for someone to show me around the local rivers. I met Spencer at dawn at a gas station just off State Highway 522. He was leaning against his tan 4Runner, its Big Lebowski bumper sticker faintly visible beneath the mud. Not on the rug, man. In his late 30s, Spencer kept his sideburns long and his hair short. He had an infectious laugh and, like the best guides, an easy way of conversing. We hit it off immediately. As we worked the river, he refined my cast and went on at length about the life cycle of the various insects in the area. There wasn't a scrub or mineral or bird or bug the formal Eagle Scout couldn't identify, and he seemed to know every trout on a personal basis. Caught that bastard last month on the same rig. Can't believe he fell for it again. When I snagged a fly in a juniper tree in the riverbanks, I winced. I'd already spent a small fortune on trout flies. Little bits of elk hair, rabbit fur, and rooster hackle feathers threaded around a tiny hook, made to mimic a wide range of aquatic insects in order to fool the fish into biting. Spencer just laughed. Shoot, I tied all these myself. He flipped open his fly box to reveal hundreds of tiny floaters, spinners, streamers, nymphs, emerges, stimulators, parachutes, and terrestrials. He had locally themed flies like the San Juan worm and the Breaking Bad-inspired crystal meth egg. He deployed subtle variations in thread color or hook size to match the insect hatches in each river or stream he fished. The flies he carried in May were different from those used in August. Sensing my curiosity, he opened up a separate fly box and pulled out one of the most strangely beautiful things I'd ever seen, a Jock Scott salmon fly, which, he explained, had been tied according to a 150-year-old recipe. It bore the feathers of a dozen different birds, flashing crimson and canary yellow, turquoise and setting sun orange as he turned it this way and that. It was finished with a dizzying spiral of gold thread around this hook shank and was capped with an eyelet made from the gut of silkworms. What the hell is that? This here's a Victorian salmon fly, calls for some of the rarest feathers in the world. Where do you get them from? There's a little community of us online that tie 'em, he said. Do you fish with those things, I asked. Not really. Most guys that tie have no idea how to fish. It's more of an art form. We pushed upstream, crouching low as we approached a fishy-looking stretch. The hobby seemed strange, searching for rare feathers to tie a fly you don't know how to cast. You think that's strange? You should look up this kid, Edwin Rist. He's one of the best tiers on the planet. He broke into the British Museum of Natural History just to get birds for these flies. I don't know if it was Edwin's Victorian-sounding name, the sheer weirdness of the story, or the fact that I was in desperate need of a new direction in life, but I became obsessed with the crime within moments. For the rest of the afternoon, as Spencer did his best to get fish on my line, I was unable to focus on anything except learning about what happened that night in Tring. But the more I found out, the greater the mystery grew, and with it, my compulsion to solve it. Little did I know, my pursuit of justice would mean journeying deep into the feather underground, a world of fanatical fly tiers and plume peddlers, cokeheads and big game hunters, ex-detectives and shady dentists. From the lies and threats, rumors and half-truths, revelations and frustrations, I came to understanding something about the devilish relationship between man and nature and his unrelenting desire to lay claim to its beauty, whatever the cost. It would be 5 consuming years before I finally discovered what happened to the lost birds of Tring.
All right, thanks everyone for listening to that. Now it's time to get into our mini-series on The Feather Thief by Kirk Wallace Johnson. That was the prologue written by Kirk, and as I mentioned earlier, we're not going to be reading anything else aloud from the book, just discussion from myself and our co-hosts. So join us as we move forward with our mini-series on The Feather Thief. Thanks, everyone.